Hi folks. Well, today I'd like to tell you the story of a Scots inventor who really transformed our world. And to do that, let's go back to the middle of the 18th century, when a revolution started that was to radically change the world and the way that humans lived completely. And that revolution became known as the Industrial Revolution. And I personally think the very key to that transformation was the invention of the steam engineer by Scottish engineer James Watt, who was born on this day in 1736 in Greenock, which is a well-known shipbuilding town, and it's located about 25 miles sort of down the River Clyde from Glasgow, so it's to the west of Glasgow, down towards the coast, so Greenock. James was the eldest of the 5 surviving children of Agnes and James Watt. His father was in the shipbuilding industry. He was a shipbuilder, and he was also a ship owner. His mother came from a well-established family, and she was a very well-educated lady, and she was said to be of a very strong character. And also, just going back another generation, his grandfather was a teacher of mathematics. So that's the sort of family that he came from. So he initially, Watt was educated at home by his mother, but later on he attended the local grammar school, Greenock Grammar School, where he showed a great talent for mathematics. So after leaving school, Watt he started working with his father, and he created engineering models for his father and for his father's business. Unfortunately, at this time, I think Watt was about 18. Very sad. His mother died, and then his father suffered severe financial problems with his business. So Watt was really forced to leave home and to make his own way in the world. So he decided to set himself up as a precision instrument maker. First in London, he moved down to London and set himself up there, but then I think after only about a year or so in London, he decided to return, and he came back and established himself in Glasgow. So here he was in Glasgow trying to establish himself making these precision instruments, and the University of Glasgow had been bequeathed some astronomical instruments, and they asked Watt if he could repair them for them. So Watt made a fine job of this, and actually the instruments were subsequently installed in the Macfarlane Observatory at Glasgow in the city, and that was the first purpose-built university observatory in Britain, and so he'd obviously done a good job in that. So he was then offered the opportunity to open a small workshop within the grounds of the university, and he specialised in maintaining and repairing scientific instruments. So whilst he's working there, he became friends with a famous professor, Professor Joseph Black, who was quite a renowned Scottish physicist and chemist, whose own study of a thing called latent heat marks the beginning of the modern science of thermodynamics, which is, thermodynamics is the branch of physics that deals with heat and work and temperature and how they relate to energy. So this was Professor Black's speciality, as it were. So Professor Black started discussing with Watt the question of steam engines, and especially what they talked about, what was then known as the Newcomen engine. So this was the very first fuel-burning engine in the world, which had been invented by an Englishman called Thomas Newcomen in 1712. And whilst this engine did use steam, it was hugely inefficient, as it wasted most of its energy. So in 1763, Watt was asked to repair a Newcomen engine which belonged to the university. And he discovered that even after he'd repaired it, the engine was barely efficient. And after much experimentation, he was able to demonstrate to people that about 3/4 of the energy of this engine was lost on each cycle. And that was because he discovered the cylinder was being repeatedly heated and then cooled. So Watt's great invention, which came about a couple of years later in May 1765, was to develop what is called the steam condenser, and which really what this allowed was that the hot steam in the engine, instead of cooling the whole engine down, the hot steam in the engine is taken away and is allowed to condense in a separate chamber away from the cylinder. And the cylinder could then be maintained at what you might call a constant operating temperature. And Watt also invented, alongside the condenser, this thing that he called a steam jacket, which he surrounded the cylinder with. So it was this that made, because what happened then was that less energy was lost, and therefore the engine is much more efficient. And Watt was able to produce a working model of his engine later that same year. Probably you may remember I certainly do, when we were at school, young children at school, we would all read the story about James Watt inventing the steam engine after watching the lid on a kettle bubbling up, lifting up and down with the steam. And that had, apparently that had demonstrated to Watt the power of steam. And this story is often dismissed as a myth, just as a sort of fairy tale. But in actual fact, I think there's a feeling that it perhaps has its basis in fact, because in trying to understand the dynamics of heat and steam, James Watt carried out many laboratory experiments which are documented in his diaries, and these show that when he was conducting these experiments, that he often used a kettle as the boiler to generate the steam. So I suspect the kettle played a big part in this, in his development of this the steam condenser and the associated steam jacket, which changed the steam engine completely. However, Watt wasn't able to develop he struggled to get the engine accepted commercially, although he had made the working model, and I think he did make some other models of it. So he felt he needed help with this, and he was extremely fortunate that he was able to forge a friendship and a partnership with a gentleman called Matthew Boulton, who was an English manufacturer, and Matthew Boulton agreed that he would fund the development of the engine at his works in Birmingham, and the two men formed a company called Boulton and Watt, and this company went on to become a major supplier of steam engines worldwide, really. And I think quite a number of their engines still exist in various museums around the world. Watt, however, was an inventor and a scientist, And he himself, he hated being involved in the practicalities of business. And I think that's why the partnership with Matthew Boulton works so well. Because Watt famously said once that he hated discussing terms, for instance, with somebody or asking them for money. So he continued to try and improve the efficiency of his engines. So he wasn't content and didn't just sit back on his laurels. He wanted to continue to improve the efficiency, and it really was, whilst his first invention of the steam condenser and the steam jacket, yes, radically changed the steam engine concept, and it was instantly started getting used in much greater ways. However, it was his next invention that was to truly revolutionize the use of steam as a power source that would change our lives. Because his initial steam engines and the Newcomb engines before really could only be applied, if I put it this way, they could only be applied in one direction, and in fixed premises. And therefore they were mostly used at that time in mines to pump out water. So the shaft could only go in one way, and it had to be fixed. And so Watt was looking at this and trying to work out how he can make the engine more efficient and be used in other areas. And he invented what is called parallel motion. I'm sorry if this is getting a bit technical. I'm not an engineer, but I found it quite inspiring rereading this whole story and how he had continually wanted to improve. And I think that's a factor in scientific minds, that they always want to keep improving. Anyway, so he invented what is called parallel motion, which was and is a mechanical linkage that allows a rod that is moving straight up and down to transmit motion to a beam whilst it moves in an arc. And if that sounds complex, what it really means is they can use it to turn a wheel. This masterpiece of invention, and I don't use that word inadvisely, I think this was a masterpiece of invention. So it allowed steam engines, therefore, then to really replace the water wheels, the horses, and the sailcloths of sailing ships. All those suppliers of power to mankind for centuries could now be replaced by steam. So what was heralded by his invention of the parallel motion was this era of factory production, where you could have wheels turning and belts powering things. You could have a steam train powering the wheels. You could have steam ships transporting goods and people all around the world. So it was that invention. Whilst the first invention, and it's right, the first invention is the one that's normally talked about, the invention of the steam condenser allied to the steam jacket. Yes, that did produce this first really highly efficient steam engine. But I personally feel it was his subsequent invention of the parallel motion was equally as important, if not more so, because all of a sudden steam engines could become, and did become, the power force for humanity to drive forward. And we all know what happened then, the railways opening up places, bigger ships, larger factories producing goods at cheaper price, etc, etc, etc. So Watt, however, as I said, he was an inventor. So whilst he did well out of business, and especially his partnership with Boulton, but he continued inventing all his life. And that's, again, another track I've seen in inventors, that they very rarely do they just rest on their laurels. They want to keep inventing and improving. And what worked not just with steam engines, which I found quite amazing. He made many discoveries in chemistry. In fact, he almost made a bleach type item, but anyway, somebody beat him to it, I think, on that one. But he did invent, which I hadn't realised, he invented a portable copying machine, which could be used for the copying of letters and documents. Now, at this time, there was no way of making a copy of a document other than a clerk would handwrite it out. That was the only way you could do it. So clerks were employed to copy documents all the time. So Watt invented this machine, and it was, he set up a little company, James Watt and Co., which he later gave to his children, I think, and they ran it. And this machine was very successful, and it was used in offices all around the world, even right up until the early 20th century. It was still in use. So I found that quite amazing. Watt was, as you could imagine, he was greatly respected by other prominent men of the Industrial Revolution era. And he enjoyed excellent personal relationships with his friends and colleagues, and often very long lasting. So for instance, his friendship with Professor Black from Glasgow went on his whole life, as did many other people that he met. And I suspect that was a mark of the man. But he decided to retire. But when he retired, he still wanted to carry on inventing. So he had an attic room, a garret room up the top of his house, converted into a workshop. So he carried on working there, and many of his inventions came out of this little workshop up in the attic. And fortunately, very fortunately, and it probably shows you as a mark of the respect he was held in, when his house, many years after he had gone, his house was to be demolished, the room was kept and preserved, and you can see it now exactly as it was when Watt worked there, complete with all his tools and his instruments and notebooks, everything. They preserved it completely. So you can go and see this, and I must make a point of doing this once I can get back out and about. So it's in the Science Museum in London, and it forms part of an exhibition which is called James Watt and Our World. So I think that certainly shows you a mark of how highly he was held by his colleagues and by everybody. So unfortunately, James Watt, he died in 1819 at the age of 83. He was very much honoured during his lifetime, so it wasn't just after his life that he was very much honoured during his lifetime. He was made a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which was very prestigious in those days, and still is. And he was also elected member of many other societies in Britain and in Europe. There are many statues commemorating this man and his achievements, and not least a large statue that was erected to him in Westminster Abbey. The honour I like most, I think, that he received was that the word we use today, all these years after how many years is that, 190 or something, 184 or something, since he was born. The word we use today as a measurement of power, so is in use by us today, which is the word Watt, was officially named after him. So perhaps, if you're looking to get a 100-watt bulb, or you want to buy a 3-kilowatt fire, or you want an oven that is 7 kilowatts or whatever, if ever you use those words, or if you ever see them or anything like that, perhaps you know, it might prompt in your mind this remarkable Scotsman whose inventions transformed our lives. Well, as usual, I hope you enjoyed that little insight into a bit of Scottish history. If you do, if you like to comment on it, that's great. I love reading your comments. I do try always to read them all and to try and reply to as many as I can. And it just leaves me to say, as always, and as usual, I want to wish you all the very best from Scotland.